Welcome back, artists. I'm Wyatt Paints, and today I've got a record of trials and tribulations. A fellow gamer asked me if I'd be willing to print and paint his cable he got from CA3D, and I've been waiting to paint something from that studio for a while now. So, long story short, I'm painting the time-traveling mutant this week, but there is a single dark cloud over this video. I attempted to upgrade the video quality by buying a camera instead of using my phone. It did not go well. Not only was a quality suspect, it ended up bjorking some of my footage. Lesson learned. Lesson learned. From now on, I'll stick with what works, and definitely won't be switching cameras mid-project. Now, that's enough time wasting on my woes. There's a project waiting to get painted. Head on over to the painting table. I'm gonna grab my brushes. Let's get started. One change I think I'll keep is my fancy new workspace. And don't worry, my paint spattered space is still here, just a little more classy. It's like putting a pig in a tux, which is totally my style, so it's a win. As usual, I'm kicking off with the base, starting with Dark Earth. Now, my client wanted me to use the official render as a guide for painting cable without it needing to be exactly like it. This is kind of a double-edged sword for a commission painter. On one hand, having a fully rendered example makes the decision-making unnecessary, and it serves as a much better example of what my client is looking for, much better than the usual instruction of make it cool. On the other hand, the CG render sets a high bar for the final look, and that sets a significant stress level for me to perform to expectations. Thankfully, I've worked with them before and have a decent idea of what they like, so I'm not too worried. But I'm telling you this because even with my experience doing this, I still feel the stress. The only thing to do about it is to push through it. After a few coats, the dirt was based, but needed some added depth, so a light tone was brought in as an all-over wash. The dirt was already pretty dark for my taste, so I wanted to keep this light so I didn't make it too dark. And I love a makeup brush for this. It's floofy enough to hold plenty of wash, but then acts like a mop to pick up any large pools. I used to use my normal size 2 round. While it's okay for panel lining, when utilizing for an all-over wash, it becomes super difficult to get even coverage, mainly because it could only manipulate a small amount of wash at a time, and it needed reloading often. Then during those reloads, my live edge would begin to dry, so when I would come back with the next load, it would actually layer on top, giving me some nasty coffee staining. And since I've switched, all-over washes are easy peasy. I followed this up with a dry brush of khaki to bring out all of the sculpted details. Next, a bit of greedy gold for the shell casings. Here, I mixed in a few drops of airbrush medium to thin it down. I picked up this bottle a few weeks ago, and I have been loving how creamy it makes my paint. While you can still over-thin this as you could with water, it has a lot more room for error. In fact, I'm going to be utilizing this a lot for this project. And can you blame me? Look how smooth this metallic is going on. Next up, sepia ink. This was for some quick detailing of the casings as they were looking a little flat. I had to keep this very reserved because it doesn't take much to overdo this step, only just a few swipes here and there. After a couple of minutes, that base was looking good. It just needed Rachel's teddy bear to add a bit more lore. And as an extra touch of flavor, it looks like it has some scorch marks from fire damage that I'll have to show off, so I grabbed dark flesh tone to start. I wanted the classic teddy bear look, so a dark base for the main body is an easy choice. This was followed by Parasite Brown. This lightened the brown to more of a milk chocolate that you would associate with a classic teddy bear. I followed this with khaki for the muzzle and ear details. And then you got the Nuln Oil treatment, first to darken all the seams for dirt, wear and tear, and then a bit of stippling to darken the scorched areas. Finally, I used black to void out the eyes and nose, then added a bit more to the fire damage. I treated this sort of like edge highlighting. I only wanted to catch the tips of the frayed edges. Thankfully, since it seems like this bear has seen the front line for years, it means you have a bit more wiggle room when it comes to overdoing this. So long as you exercise good brush control and don't flood the bear by touching it with an overloaded brush, it should be easy as pie. As a final touch, I used a very light gray to add a slight reflection in the eyes and called the base done. Making my way up the model, the next step was his boots. From the reference photo, these call for a dark but slightly desaturated blue with a bronze or gold accent metallics. So I started basing with this dark navy blue. Since this blue is on the thick side, the airbrush medium showed up again to thin it down. And I just can't get over how nice it gets my paint to behave. It was laying down silky smooth with very little effort. I just know I'm going to be leaning on this medium a lot in future projects. Once it was dry, it was quite shiny, but I don't think that's the medium, it's more the paint. It's not a big deal though, because Somber Gray was coming in next to lighten and desaturate everything. Since there are a lot of little details I need to catch in this pass, I swapped over to my big floofy brush to gradually dry brush in the lighter tone. This will make it super easy to highlight all the tiny details I need to while maintaining the deep navy blue in the shadows. But it's important to check your brush often to ensure that there isn't too much paint left. Failing to do so might send you back to the navy blue for a repaint. So go slow and check your brush often. To pick out some of the metal details, it's time for some gunmetal. With a touch of airbrush medium, I really can't stress enough how much I am impressed with the addition of this medium to my paint, especially with metallic paints. It was like painting with melted butter, even when using this very old bottle of paint. I will be buying more of this, guaranteed. As a highlight, I used a lighter gunmetal from the Fanatic line. While it might be slightly confusing, I have multiple gunmetals from different companies, mainly just because I like different options. And this gunmetal is very much brighter with more luster compared to the Vallejo line. But don't sleep on Vallejo for metallics. Their liquid metal line is pretty top notch, but a little pricey. The main point of this aside is to use the paints that you like and don't feel shackled to just one brand. In fact, I like this gunmetal so much I used it for a few more accent panels around the shoe. With the metallics dried, I used some black to take care of the laces. I wish I had a quick and easy tip for these, but I've yet to find one. Best advice is go slow, put on a podcast or a YouTube channel, and just get in the zone and power through. Heck, you can even have my painting playlist running in the background, but only do this if you want to be super awesome. After laying down some flat red for the X insignias, it was time for some bronze metallics using, as luck would have it, bright bronze. Now this will be the ultimate test for the medium, as this is one of the thickest paints I have. And buttery smooth again. Nice. When it comes to brush painting metallics, I'm a die-hard dry brush enthusiast, but this medium has opened a new door for me. When I can't dry brush, my metallics will absolutely be getting the airbrush medium treatment. When it comes to a ratio mix, it's very much dependent on the starting paint. For instance, this paint being super thick needed about a 2:1 medium to paint ratio, while the two gunmetals that were before were more of a 1:1 mix. Honestly, it makes me think about doing a video solely on thinning paints. Maybe one day. To dirty up the metallics, a bit of sepia shade. This was mainly used to tone down the shine a bit from the larger sections, as it didn't make much sense that Cable would keep his boot buckles so shiny in a post-apocalypse. Also, having this shade in some seams helps separate the panels a bit more, adding definition to all of the tiny sculpted details. Finally, hardened carapace was called in to base the soles of the boots. You may notice that I have a habit of painting the soles last, and there's a reason for that. Usually, when I'm painting all the details close to the sole, I'll have a little bit of spillover onto it. So saving it for last lets it pull double duty for free, as it cleans up my earlier work. It always pays to work smarter, not harder. And just because I'm feeling frisky, I used a bit of uniform gray to highlight the edge of the sole, just to add a bit more visual interest. Though, looking back, the boots were detailed enough and it didn't really need it, it was just sort of a me thing. Moving on up the body, the legs were next for painting, which puts a spotlight on the only criticism I have on this model: these pouches. They're common in comic statues, but not separating them from the waist is always a pain, especially when resin printing, as hollowing the model creates funky situations that need creative solutions, like all these extra drain holes. So if you're a sculptor out there, please make your pouches separate parts. It would be awesome. For the pants, he needed a dusty, desaturated brown, so I mixed up some char brown with Castle Gray and applied it with a little floofy here. They're not just useful for washes. A small makeup brush can base like a pro. It honestly doesn't get any easier than this. 2 passes and it was ready for a highlight. For that, I mixed up some uniform gray and Starship exterior. Because I wanted a desaturated brown, it's important that I push these highlights towards gray. Otherwise, it'll look a bit funky if the highlights had a stronger brown tone than the base. So while it may seem weird to highlight brown with gray, you're gonna have to trust the process on this one. Thankfully, with the magic of video editing, it only takes a few seconds to see what I'm talking about. As the grays build up, the brown becomes more subtle until it's more of a suggestion of brown in the recessed folds. Looking at his knee pads, I couldn't tell if they were the same bronze on the shoes or not. So I made a judgment call and used the Parasite brown from earlier. Nothing too special here, just 2 thin coats for coverage. Then I moved on to leather brown for all of the straps and the side panels for the pouches. This was followed by a sepia wash for all the newly painted leather. The only care needed here is to ensure not to overpaint on the pants, so stay within the lines and you should be good. I then blacked out all the other panels of the pouches so that Castle Gray could be used on the center strap of each. Next, I handled all the hardware and buckles with a touch of greedy gold. Followed by dark metal for the ion grenades on his thigh. As one of the last details on his legs, each X insignia was given a splash of flat red to detail them, and the large buckle got its greedy gold treatment. Seeing as I'm about halfway done with Cable, this seemed like a perfect time to take a few moments to thank my subscribers over on Patreon. Each month, your continued support helps me keep the lights on, and for that, I can't thank you enough. If you would like to join the painting pantheon, you'll find a link to my Patreon in the description below. Down there, you'll also find the links to some of the products I use in my videos. Just know using the link won't cost you any extra, but it'll earn the channel a little bit of commission and my gratitude. For now, the top half of Cable is waiting to get painted, so let's get back to it. Body slide by 1. Back at the table with the test camera, it's time to look at the torso. His bandoliers are slightly different from his classic design, which is a nice twist. He also has a nice collection of textures for the different panels on his top. But since the render doesn't really show too much of his shirt, I decided to just wing it and do a collection of blues on the different panels. As you can most likely tell, and as I've mentioned, this is a portion of the footage that was captured on the test camera. I promise I have learned many lessons from this. First of which is Odiak is as sketchy of a company name as it seems. For the side panels, I picked up somber gray that I used for the shoes. Reusing colors here helps tie the different parts into a more cohesive whole. For this center panel, I went with Void Shield Blue. Having a lighter color in the core will help pull focus towards the center line of the model, while drawing an eye up towards his face. Unfortunately though, this effect will be greatly diminished once the coat is added, as a lot of this will be covered. To highlight, I used that same void shield on the darker panels in a light dry brush to bring up the folds in his shirt and the bulges from his muscles. Then I switched to Toxic Mist to highlight the center. I really wish this camera did a better job of actually showing this, but I hope at least some of you get a chuckle watching auto white balance go to Funky Town. And no, there was no way to turn it off. Same thing with the autofocus. With no way of turning off these features, this camera was just garbo. No worries though, it has been returned. I'll just have to keep saving up for a Sony or a Canon. For the sake of brevity, I'm going to cruise through the painting of the bandolier with a quickness. Since we needed to be yellow, I knew I was going to need a lot of layers to cover up this blue. How many layers? Somewhere between 6 and 10 or so. To be perfectly honest, my brain just kind of shuts off as soon as yellow hits my brush. And this blue tinted video is the only reminder I have for that chunk of time. I then based all the metal bits in greedy gold and then moved on to the metal arm. Since it was already prime and metallic finish, not much was needed here except for a little bit of Nuln Oil to help define the ribbing. Just keep a sponge nearby to clean up any excess and keep the larger volumes nice and bright. After I finished blacklining the arm, that's when I checked the video and noticed all the issues. So say goodbye to all the blue hue and funky strobings of the white balance. Swapping back to my phone, it was time to paint all the skin using blends of Bat Bruise and Barbarian Flesh. I like using Bat Bruise for skin shadows when I'm painting non-typical skin, and a time-traveling Omega level mutant infected with a techno-organic virus certainly fits the description of non-typical. Step 1, base all the skin with a 50-50 mix. No overthinking it. If it's skin, you want to hit it with this periwinkle. And just so they all match, it's a good idea to take care of his arm and exposed fingers as well. Then I mixed in a bit more flesh tone for the next step up. Here I start by painting in the areas that need the most coverage, and then as my brush runs out of paint, I blend the transition from the shadow areas. I do this one muscle at a time so that I can give each transition the attention it needs to look smooth. This is one of those tasks that will just take time. This is why I try to save time every place I can so that that time can be spent here, as there's no avoiding the time-consuming nature of painting skin tones. The more fancy you want to make it, the longer it's going to take. The fingers are much easier by treating them as simple cylinders, highlighting them completely and only leaving the starting color in the gaps between the fingers. On the face, it's a bit more complicated with so many wrinkles to contend with. But again, I start in the areas that I know I want full coverage, like the nose, cheeks, forehead, and chin, then blend out to the darker areas avoiding the deepest lines. After it was dry, you want to add more barbarian flesh to the mix and do it all again. Here I added a few drops of medium to thin it out a bit and up the transparency of the paint. And once again, the medium did not disappoint. As I went through the same steps again, the medium let me slowly build up the highlight and even out the tones across the skin. Finally ending with pure barbarian flesh with a bit of medium to thin it out as the final highlight to all the skin. I really can't stop loving this medium. Look how soft the arm transitions turned out. My world is forever changed. To highlight the mouth, I based the teeth and gums in light pink, and then gave it an all-over wash of light tone to help separate the teeth. Then came in with my smallest brush to dab in some bone white for each tooth, which might seem a bit dark for hero teeth, but then again, the mutant extermination post-apocalypse rarely leaves time for proper oral hygiene. Now, just because I was feeling silly and wanted to test the color for a future model, I gave him some rosy lip gloss. While it looks pretty weird on Cable, I think it's going to work well for what I have planned for it. For now, I need to clean this up with a mix of the skin tones I used earlier. Usually, I start with a darker shade and work my way up to the lighter shades until it looks good. And in general for males, I find that a shade just slightly darker than the median tone usually looks best. This also ended up being the best time to take care of the scars over his eyes, using the darker tones. Now for his eyes, I had to get a bit creative. The scarred eye is just going to be based in Starship exterior with no pupil. Now his left eye tends to be depicted brimming with psionic power, so I went with a base of greedy gold and a slight shading of light tone. Now the hair needed some attention, starting with the base of Castle Gray. Hair needs to be made not to overpaint on the skin. When it comes to the hairline itself, I find that a bit of skin tone bleeding into the hair is fine and it looks okay. But if the color from the hair bleeds onto the skin, you're gonna have a problem. So take it easy along the edge, as it would be a giant pain to do touch-ups at this point. Once the gray was set, I dry brushed in Spaceship exterior to highlight the silver Proctus mane. After this, the hair would be done. Just don't forget to do his eyebrows. And for them, I don't bother with the highlight color, just use the darkest color you use to base the hair, and in this case, Castle Gray. With the main body done, I switched focus to his cloak. I again wanted a desaturated color. The render used a slightly green tan, but seeing as green is my favorite color, I wanted a bit more vibrance. So I mixed in bright camel green and ash gray to base the entire cape. An overbrush application with a floofy breakup brush will take care of this pretty quickly. Once based front and back, it needed a wash to help bring up the texture of the fabric. So it was time for Beltan Green Wash. Now with a heavy textured surface like this, it's kinda hard to avoid patchiness. But here, I want it to work for me, as I imagine Cable scavenged this cloak from a corpse or trash heap, so staining will fit in as a bit of natural weathering. Sometimes it's easier to work with the shortcomings of a method rather than trying to fight against it. After the wash, it was a little bit too vibrant, so I remade the gray-green mix that I basted in and dry brushed all of the large billows. Just like with the pants, this will dull down and dust up the green to more of a neutral color, adding age and fatigue to the cloak. And so long as you're checking your brush for overloading, it'll be pretty hard to overdo this, as the deeper folds will act like buffer lanes to keep and maintain those deeper shadows. As a final desaturating highlight, ash gray. Same idea as the last step, just half as strong. So I need the brush nearly out of paint before it touches the cloak. But that also means I'll need more strokes before I notice a change, which gives me plenty of time to hit the brakes before I overdo it. Also, it's a good idea to give extra attention to the frayed edges. It'll help show its age. After all that highlighting, I felt the rips needed a bit more definition, so they each got a bit of Nuln Oil, along with the deeper folds around the neck. Now for the final major piece, his gun. One of my core comic book memories is seeing Cable on the cover of X Factor with a giant chromed out, vaguely gun-shaped hunk of metal in his hand. So it made sense to prime the metallic finish and work from there. But first, these hands need a bit of love by basing the gloves in hardened carapace and the knuckle guards in ash gray. But just a side note, the metallic finish isn't really a primer, so it's delicate and paint has a tough time hanging onto the surface. So these needed like 4 coats to get full opacity. It's still totally doable, but I wanted to put out that warning regardless. The first 2 coats will look like garbage. Just keep them thin and add a few more. With the hands done, it's time to paint the gun proper. And I really want that big silver gun aesthetic, so I just picked out bits and greebles to paint gray and black. Then I started getting that silly feeling again, and I wanted to do an oil wash on it, and it seemed fitting to oil the gun. If you want to do this, just make sure to give it several coats of clear varnish to protect your work. Oil paints need a stronger thinner than water, and in this case, white spirits. It only takes a few drops to get a nice thin wash, and you'll want to be very deliberate with it and only touch where you want it, because you don't really want to work this with your brush too much. Even with the clear varnish, it only takes a few too many brush strokes to eat through your earlier work. So no, you're playing with fire here. Make sure you practice this on a model that doesn't matter first. After the oil dried, I used gunmetal and gritty gold on a few bits here and there to add up some details. Unfortunately, that footage all got banished to the shadow realm. Afterwards, I glued him up and called him done. And bang, he looks pretty great. And when compared to the reference photo, it looks pretty darn close. I'm sure my client's gonna like it. But what about you all? Do you think I did this awesome sculpt justice? Maybe if one were so inclined, they could wire up an LED into his left eye to better match the render. But my client was pretty nonplussed on the idea of spending more on this commission, and I don't blame him. He looks great as is. Now I've got a conga line of 1/6 scale figures that are just waiting to get done. And while this one took a little bit longer to finish, I don't have time to dilly-dally. So I'm gonna have to leave you for now. But as always, thank you for watching, stay creative, and always enjoy the process.